Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in Washington, D.C. at the conference sponsored by McAleese Associates and Credit Suisse. And we have with us the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manufacturing and Industrial Base Policy, Dr. Jerry McGinn. Jerry, thanks for joining us.
Great. Hey, Vago, it's great to see you. Great to be here.
Everybody, all eyes were or many eyes were on your presentation. Obviously, this is kind of a key industrial conference. We had a lot of government leaders in the, who've been speaking. Adam Smith, the ranking member, Keith Kellogg's going to be a dinner speaker tonight. We had you, Admiral Moran, the Air Force Vice, the Army Vice, action-packed. I want to start off, with some of the things that you said in your presentation. One of your office monitors the health of the U.S. industrial base, and you mentioned that there were some things that were, some areas that were at risk. What are some of those at-risk areas, and what are some of the ththings that the department has to do to address them?
Great. Now, thanks, Vago. Yeah, the way we look at the industrial base is by sector. So we maintain a strong relationship with the companies and understanding their financial health, but we look at the electronics areas, we look at shipbuilding and so on. And where we do see some weaknesses are in some of the defense unique areas, some areas that have such as missiles and munitions, as well as some parts of the electronics world. Where we see some of the weaknesses, going back to munitions, is we see there's both capacity issue, like in that area we've got big ebbs and flows of orders. So how does the base maintain the capability needed to meet the demand for AMRAAM, for instance, or JDAMs, right? Another area where we see weaknesses is on rocket motors, because we haven't built a new rocket motor in essentially 50 years. So how do you maintain the engineering and design skills to do that? And that's an area where we've struggled. And then the other area I talked about in my remarks was a lot of the things we buy are from commercial businesses. That is, there are some markets like the materials market, things like metals, like aluminum, that are just incredibly, very, very large commercial segments for small, but very unique defense applications. And maintaining access to that for systems like LCS and MRAP is really important, and so we work very closely with the services and the companies to help maintain those capabilities.
Do you see anything that's sort of red listed in terms of concerns? I mean, if you were going to use red, yellow, green, are these, yellow issues, are they red issues, are they green merging to yellow? I mean, how would you categorize them?
I think a lot of them are in the yellow category. I mean, things like microelectronics is an area where it's very commercial, but we have, Micron is the big producer of microelectronics, but there's a lot of effort to move more and more microelectronics capabilities development offshore to China or other places. And that's where it's, maintaining that defensive capability or the access for that those systems is where that kind of is the yellow kind of phrase, where you have one supplier or a supplier with not a robust area, so we want to keep that from going to red. An area where when it gets to red, when it gets to a high-risk area, that's where we develop mitigation options. We work with the services to do new investments, like they've done in the Trusted Foundries Access Program, which is in the 2017 budget that's before Congress, or in areas, like for rocket motors, where we're doing the GBSD, the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent, that's going to build new rocket motors, right? So those are some of the mitigation options that we try to do to maintain the base.
You mentioned offshore sources of supply. Obviously, DoD has always sought to maintain domestic sourcing. But over the past 15 years, certainly after 9/11, U.S. procurement did become increasingly global. Our allies had a lot of capabilities that we needed, whether it was electronic warfare, whether it was batteries, whether it was even something as simple as bullets, where some overseas guys got a significant bump because our domestic industry couldn't satisfy that demand fast enough. And obviously there are other examples, MRAP being another, the armored vehicle, obviously, that saved so many lives. As you're looking at this globalized base, obviously the President of the United States has made a lot of comments, America first, but also Buy America and Build America. There are some members of Congress that have been passionately opposed to that, Senator McGinn being the most prominent example. What are the potential implications for a Buy America, Build America, America first approach at a DoD that has, by strategy, become increasingly globalized to stitch together not only the industries benefit from the technologies, but bring together in an alliance sense some of our closest allies to make it as seamless as possible?
Well, I think it is a global defense industrial base. I mean, I think there's a clear recognition of that, and we work closely with our suppliers, and their supply chain goes across the globe. And there's sort of there's a striation between our close allies, those that we go to war with or conflicts with, the Canadians, the Australians, the Brits, and NATO allies. We have strong relationships, and they include supplier relationships. And I think it's where that would have. We'd have less of a necessarily impact on the defense industrial base. Those would not be the first kind of relationships where we're always looking to build domestic capability, but it's areas where there's more risk, potential competitors like China and parts, or Russia, where the relationships are a bit more kind of spotty or challenging. That's where we'd want, if they're in our supply chains, we want to start moving out of that business, that kind of building that domestic capability.
How significant a role do some of these other countries play, for example, in the U.S. Industrial base, whether they are China, whether they're Russia? I mean, is it a larger role than most people would expect them to be playing?
It's not a very large role. I mean, it is. We contract with the primes, and they're all U.S. based, and their supply chain is generally U.S. or kind of partners based. The only time where we get into the countries like Russia and China is really at the sort of base materials like rare earth elements or metals or things like that. That's where we come into those base kind of materials. So we get into it there, but there we don't really have any. We try to avoid those suppliers if at all possible.
Is there, for years, because of diminution, because of merger and acquisition activity, and I want to ask you about that, but because of M&A activity, there were fewer numbers of competitors. So part of the DoD strategy for now almost 20 years has been look to overseas sources of supply. Ultimately, if the system is manufactured in the United States, that satisfies it. Will there be any impact, do you think, on the DoD's ability to go to overseas suppliers in order to satisfy some of its systems needs? I mean, you could look at the trainer program and say all three of the trainers have some foreign DNA in them, whether the T-100 that's offered by Leonardo DRS, you've got the Saab Boeing, rather I should say it's Boeing, but with some strong Swedish DNA in that proposal, and obviously Lockheed has a lot of Korean DNA, or even KAI, some would argue is a little bit in the lead in that particular relationship in some respects, obviously because the airplane has been produced in Korea actually. Do you see any sort of impact on the DoD's ability to source if there are any conditions that are put on weapon systems that limit them to domestic supply?
I can't foresee any of that at the moment. I mean, we're going to get the systems we need to support the warfighter as expeditiously as possible, and the Congress is going to support that, and we'll comply with any law that is passed, of course. But I see this as a sort of the fact of life that we're dealing with our close allies and partners, and the fact that they're industrial partners with us. As long as we are able to maintain sufficient domestic content and domestic capabilities according to law, I think that's all to the good.
You mentioned legislation. Obviously, one of the pieces of legislation is the dissolution of your office, the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. Obviously, last year, was in law to break this office up into an R&D component and an acquisition component. What kind of implication does that have for your office, whose role has increased over the past couple of years? It used to have a very strong capability. It lost a lot of capability. There was a rebuilding over the past 8 years. You were part of that. You were a Bush appointee who came in as an SES and have played a key role working with Andre Gudger, the past boss of the office. Tell us, what's next for you guys, and where do you fall out in this reorganization?
Well, I was looking for you for the answer to that. I thought you had talked to the Secretary on this. We're waiting for the Secretary to act on the recommendations that came out of Mr. Stackley's panel that he's developed. I haven't seen those. But, it creates 2 undersecretaries, acquisition and sustainment and research and engineering. And our office, as you alluded to, kind of really cuts across both of those capability areas. And I think the crafters of the legislation, the drafters said, it's really up to the Secretary to implement. He can recreate the offices as they were or create new ones. And the one thing I'm confident of is that the capabilities that we've developed, the manufacturing capabilities, as well as the industrial base and global the markets kind of analysis, is going to, if anything, increase in the current administration. There's been more focus on manufacturing, and that we're seeing. So I'm confident that however it shakes out, we're going to the capabilities that have been resident in this office are going to continue to make an impact.
One of the things that you guys did was focus a lot on manufacturing, obviously, and you mentioned that, and obviously that's a priority for President Trump. What are some of the initiatives? Do you think any of the initiatives that were started under the last administration to start these incubators, to start these technology hubs, are those things going to be things you think that are going to survive? And are you at this point getting any additional guidance about how, from the White House to sort of change the view or to submit plans or ideas? What sort of, what do you think will survive, and what is some new guidance that you guys are getting?
Well, the new guys, we haven't, they're still kind of staffing up on as far as they do have a kind of director of the National Technology Council, but we haven't received guidance specifically for defense, other than, they want to maintain manufacturing capabilities. But we've pleasantly, the initiatives that were started on the prior administration, particularly on the Manufacturing USA Institutes, which were a series of advanced institutes focusing on areas like 3D printing, advanced fibers and textiles. Those were already fully funded in the budget, the DoD component, and we've seen strong support from across both sides of the aisle for that capability. And I'm very optimistic that will continue to go forward. It's whether or not they do more of the institutes, I don't know, but because that's growing the defense industrial base, that's building advanced technology capabilities, and very much in line with the current administration.
One of the things you guys also do is you play a vital role in merger and acquisition activity, and you started on the job around about the same time that Lockheed Sikorsky, tiny little deal came up.
Small little deal. Yeah, that was my first 2 months in the office was working that, and so I luckily I had already done M&A a little bit in the corporate sector. So yes, we do, and what we look at in transaction is we're not trying to get in the middle of the private sector and how they organize their businesses, but we're focusing on maintaining competition for the department, make sure we have adequacy of supply of the capabilities we need, and that we maintain competition so we have the lowest price for the warfighter of the system. So that's our focus, and that's how we look at every transaction, how it impacts the larger defense marketplace.
Well, one of the questions that I had for you is there has been a ramp up in M&A activity. There's an expectation that there's going to be more of it. In fact, there is an expectation that there's going to be a loosening of M&A rules. From your standpoint, any guidance or direction on that at this point? And do you have the staffing in place to support the kind of deal flow that is expected by some people? Because some folks do expect to see some much larger deals come through in the expectation that it'll be a more acquisition-friendly administration.
Well, we haven't seen any change in policy to that regard at all. I think the maintaining competition is important, and the current policy is is extended for several administrations now on both sides of the aisle, is that we have the adequate amount of prime contractors to deliver the main systems we need, and we don't want to get in the middle of mergers and acquisitions, but companies can get too large where they have more pricing power and so on, that can create challenges for the department. And so we look at transactions in those kind of lights, and we haven't seen the need for consolidation at the prime level any further. And consolidation that happens among the service providers or divestitures, that's all to the good. That helps increase competition and so on. But I haven't seen any change in policy there.
Obviously, one of Dr. Carter's key initiatives was work to try to get Silicon Valley and private industry to contribute as much and build new bridges between DoD and the high-tech sector, no matter where it is. Are those sorts of initiatives, you think, going to continue? Because your office has been working those sorts of things, including and particularly with some smaller innovative companies for quite some time. Do you guys expect to continue and even accelerate those efforts to try to bring some of these great ideas, percolate them up, and use them even to pollinate up to the prime level where, some people feel that the big guys sometimes are very comfortable being the big guys, and that some of the better ideas you can get may come in from some of these smaller disruptive thinkers?
I think they may not be named the same. DIUX was Dr. Carter's initiative. They may do something else, right? But I think the general thrust is going to continue. We need to grow kind of the industrial base, because there's recognition that the technology that we need for tomorrow's fight is not only coming out of DARPA, it's not only coming out of DoD labs, it's also coming from the commercial world. So how do we better kind of bridge that gap? And so those kind of efforts are going to continue. And we've seen that in support for that in the current administration, and we're continuing to move down that road because there are needs for how do you do contracting with non-traditional suppliers and the like, and so I see that continuing.
And there's one thorny question that was asked by somebody in this audience when I mentioned them. I said, I'm going to see Jerry later. He said, hey, well, you should ask him, how can the DoD, and he did turn serious though. I mean, he said, how does the DoD cope with an acquisition universe in which the president could tweet or become involved, as in the case of Air Force One, as in the case of Joint Strike Fighter, where there is sort of an established process system. You guys work so very hard to make sure that a big announcement is kept totally under wraps, comes after the market closes, and a whole series of other things to sort of cushion stock impacts and things like that. Does that present a challenge, and how does the department deal with something like that, where you have a president who has opinions and he has a tool and he's very comfortable expressing those opinions?
Well, I think it's a process. We're figuring that out. I think my boss, Mr. McStravick, who's performing the duties of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, he actually got a Twitter account, so we could keep track of things. And but I think that I'm not in the source selection business, so I can't say. But I think the specifics. But I think the companies themselves are starting to think about this. Or they should be. What's our strategy if we're a subject of a tweet? How do we respond to that? So the companies need to think about it, and the department, in the source selection process, is thinking about it.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. You guys are obviously a key player in that. Anytime a foreign entity wants to buy anything, particularly from a DoD perspective, bring us up to speed on anything new on that front.
Well, CFIUS, as it is known, is not a disease, but it's a process by which we review foreign direct investment. It's where I spend, a good chunk of my time, almost 50% really, and it's the most sensitive work we do, frankly. And there we're about protecting the technological edge of the United States, making sure that there's no security implications of foreign investment. So we are all in for foreign investment, but we're starting to see some trends which are concerning to us, in areas like semiconductors and the like, to where we have to look at these transactions, and we have to really adapt, I think, the CFIUS model to be more nimble to address the changing marketplace. And there's discussions going on in the department across the interagency with the hell on that. So.
And where are the most particular areas of concern? You mentioned semiconductor, but what are the nations that are getting involved in this that make you concerned?
Well, I think you probably can name the list. It's
China, Moscow,
China, Russia. This country. We're all for foreign trade and the like, but it's where it impacts our national security interests. Is where we get, and particularly when countries like that are involved, we have to look at it much more closely.
And congratulations to your alma mater on ending the drought. I know that you were very, very excited about that.
My 14-year-old had never seen Army win, but thank God that is now over. Be Navy.
I will stay out of that. Go Navy, beat Army. Thanks very much, Jerry.
Good seeing you, Vago. Okay, thanks very much.